Personal narratives, the way we talk about ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about our experiences in life are so important. And it was a client who casually said to me in a coaching call, Jenny, it would be really interesting to hear more about your journey. You've done so many different things in your life. I'd love the chance to kind of unpack those and get to know you a little bit better. And I thought, okay, I am up for the challenge. And so today's podcast is all about my journey in becoming the leader I am today. I hope to impart to you the importance of those milestone experiences in your lives. Maybe you'll reflect on some of the milestones in your lives as you listen along, and the meaning that we apply to these milestones and what they signify to us and how we interpret them, which is such an important part about creating identity for ourselves. So the irony today for me is I am on the morning of a day when tonight I am going to be recognized as an established entrepreneur at the BYA's, the Business Women of the Year Awards here in Ottawa, Canada. And the experience of being nominated, completing the application, and being selected as a finalist, I'm one of three. At the time of this recording, I don't know if I have been successful at winning the category or not. But tonight there's going to be a group of 10 of my besties, women who are around me, who care deeply about me and my work, who understand the work of a business person and a leader, as well as my dear patient husband who's going to be sitting beside me at this event. And it's really got me reflecting on how I got here. How did I become somebody who would be nominated for something like this, which by the way is a whole thing, like the experience of being nominated and owning it and being comfortable with being recognized. In the past, I probably would have deflected. I would have said, oh, it was a team effort, something like that. But I am working in the stage that I'm at in my leadership of really owning my personal power and my personal leadership and taking responsibility for the choices that I've made. And of course, the point of this podcast is to invite you to do exactly the same. So let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about little Jenny. Let's talk about where I grew up, what I learned. A very typical, very average middle class home where everything that I needed was provided to me. My family, we were really lucky. My mom ended up being a stay-at-home mom, but she also worked sort of 2 nights a week, which what she called her mad money. I love that phrase. And that was the money she could spend wherever she wanted. And I've always been very people motivated and very curious. I can remember, and I've said this on a couple of other podcasts, being in the back seat of a car when I was very little, looking out the window and seeing all these cars go by and thinking, oh my gosh, the world is such a big place. And then at the same time thinking, wow, I wonder if I'm going to have enough time to meet these people. How am I going to get to know them all? So that genuine curiosity piece. And I imagine I was a lot to take as a kid. Like I imagine I had a big personality. My mom tells me that I was so busy as a kid that I never wanted to slow down to eat, which I find interesting because I love food now. But I can definitely remember being very impatient, restless. The games I played as a kid were things like Nancy Drew. We had this playhouse in the back and we'd make concoctions and we'd be outside with my friend Karina, and very vivid imaginations. We played in the sandbox. We were let to run around. Makes me sad when I think about kids today and the way their lives are, because we had a great upbringing. There was a lot of freedom, and I definitely think of myself as a free child. Like I had a lot of imagination. I lived in my head. So I also played piano. I'll just say that. I was one of the things that I did that I was good at, and I enjoyed it. There was a turning point when I was in about grade 7 where I got a really good mark on an exam for piano. And I thought, well, I got a good mark and I didn't really try that hard. So what would it be like if I tried harder? And even back then, for me, it was just as much about the relationship with my piano teacher as it was about the piano part. I chose music graduating from high school because I thought that it would be the career that would bring me the most interest. I thought it's a bottomless pit of information. It's going to be the thing that's going to fuel me forever. And I was right, actually. I embarked on a Bachelor of Music degree at McGill University, which is a university here in Montreal, having no idea what musicians did all day, not a clue, just knowing that I was good at something and this was a next hurdle I was going to jump. And I just want to harken back to this idea. The very first podcast that I did on this Underdog Leadership podcast was about Jenny Mitchell, the hurdle jumper. And so for those achievers in the group or those, people that love to accomplish things, you will relate to that expression. And gosh, was I ever lucky. I think McGill was a very beautiful, formative place for me. I grew, I got better. And then I went at the end of my bachelor's degree, I wanted to continue learning. I knew that. And I wanted to do a master's degree. So I applied to a bunch of different schools and ended up going to Manhattan School of Music, which is in New York City on the Upper West Side. So I think 122nd Street and Broadway, if you know the city at all. And that was my first experience of an international community. So we had people coming from all over the place. And even then, as I think about it, I loved the learning. I loved my teacher. I loved the metropolitan experience of it. But I always gravitated to connections. I was part of a chamber music group, which with 3 people. I was involved in action activities. I loved making connections with my colleagues. And I was beginning to realize that this whole sitting in a practice room by myself, thinking, being alone was not going to fly from a long-term perspective, but I had committed to it and therefore I kept going. I'm going to fast forward. I also completed a doctorate of music degree, which sounds very fancy. And I think in some ways it's one of the things I downplay because I did it. I assume other people can do it as well. That sort of self deprecating or self sabotaging behavior, which, by the way, I also talk about in another podcast 7 ways to stop self sabotaging. And that doctorate degree really fermented, that's funny, cemented for me kind of 2 things at once. One, I got into this incredibly prestigious program, and there was this moment that I remember. Speaking of milestones, I'm sitting in the audience listening to my professor's studio of piano players all present in this concert. Each of us played in it. And I had 2 thoughts. One was, oh my God, I can't believe I'm here. This is incredible. And 2, wow, these people want this life, this experience way more than I do. Milestone moment, right? So from there, I graduated, I finished, because I'm a finisher, and promptly got married and had kids. That's the next phase of things. I tumbled into that. And I remember it was really important for me that my doctorate degree and my kids never overlapped, because I had this great fear that if I had children, I wouldn't finish the degree, and it was important to me. But to understand where I came from, until I was 30 years old, I was in school. So that academic mindset, that pursuit of learning, I think the freedom of being in a doctorate degree, especially in something like music, any of my arts people, those of you listening to this that came from an arts world, I think it's one of the best educations ever. It forces you to learn, to be autonomous. It forces you to learn discipline. Those are many of the gifts I got out of that degree. And so children happen and I start getting restless. And having children, if you've ever done it, is a real stretch on your personal growth and a real reevaluation of things. And one thing was very clear was I was working as a musician. I was a performing musician. I did my debut at Carnegie Hall when I was, I don't know, about 27 years old with a colleague, a flute player. And that was an amazing experience, but the work was not the kind of work I really loved. Let me explain. I was teaching, which actually has been a thread through all of my work. I think of my work as an educator and as a coach as that continuous learning experience, but it was all evenings. It was all weekends. My husband had a regular job. I was like, this is not going to work long term. And so that transition happens. And when I talk to people about career transitions, it can get really hard. You can get stuck in your mindset about, well, what could I do otherwise? And so I took the skills I had from my doctorate degree, which were I could read, I could research, and I could write. And I translated those into And I remember specifically looking for daytime hours. I wanted to work during the day. Novel concept. And I fell into grant writing. I fell into writing grants for different organizations. And I fell into fund development, fundraising, which many of you know me from, through raising money for pianos at the conservatory where I was working. So this flow, the themes I'd like to pick up on here as you're listening to this is, where could I, like Jenny, be curious? And also acknowledging that restless piece, like, what's not feeling right here, or what's not jiving? What am I looking for? I wish I could tell you that at that time I had all the hindsight in the world to be reflective, to be pensive, to journal, to meditate, to yoga. But I did none of that stuff. I kind of threw myself at the next task and the next hurdle. But I was constantly moved forward by this sort of um, observantness that I had. And because I was a relatively, believe this or not, it's hard to imagine, shy person along the way, I loved being a people watcher. And so seeing these people and noticing these things and what were these people doing, what were those people doing, was a really important part of my milestones. So fast forward, I work as a fundraiser. Really, I worked as a fund development person. And what I want to clarify is, I was one of those strange unicorns that was only a consultant. I did have time where I was seconded into organizations where I worked there, for a year and a half, but I was always a consultant role. So never committed to being part of the company, the organization, or the not-for-profit. And I think that's probably my independent spirit. I think that's probably the fact that I really, really value my autonomy. And it's something I've had to kind of reconcile as I think about my relationships with people and others in my world. And I came from a world of small business. So people say, how did you become an entrepreneur? What was that all about? And I came from a world of small business. That was very common to me. Around the kitchen table, my mom ran a small business. She was a retailer. She had a general store on the main street in a small town outside of Ottawa, and she ran retail. She sold things in her store to make money. They happened to be women's apparel. And on the other side, my dad was a sales rep for Hewlett Packard. You'll remember that name from way back when. And so he also was very independent, did his own thing, was responsible for his own targets. So this sense of autonomy and self-discipline, I think, was instilled in me a long time ago. And I always wanted to do my own thing. I think I do have a bit of I don't think it's a rebellious streak. I think it's more like, um, what else could we do? How else could we do it different? And definitely that free spirit shows up a lot. And I was lucky that, I had, when we talk about scaffolding and supports and how I was equipped as a kid, I had great opportunities. I can't complain about how lucky I was to have these chances. But that time in my 30s, two little kids under my feet, and trying to figure out who I am, trying to put food on the table, trying to build a marriage, it was a tough time. So I want to just send a little bit of love out to those people out there listening that are in that trenches of those times. And small moments like going for a walk, small moments, the simple joys of things. I remember how much I loved coffee. I remember, sidebar, I remember with two little kids, you'd push the stroller out. I was in Brooklyn at the time, and I'd go down 2 steps and I'd take the dog and I'd walk up to the coffee shop, and I'd just be so grateful for that coffee. And then I would go over to the playground with the kids, and I would basically like stare at people until they talked at me because I was so desperate for conversation and connection because I was alone. So I smile because I think, of course, that's me. Of course, that is, I think, one of my gifts is my ability to hold space for people and to build communities, to create, in my professional world, I do volunteer committees, or I create masterminds. That's one of the key programs that I run, is the Penthouse, which is a mastermind for women leaders. This is just the way I've learned through the world. This restlessness, this impatientness of mine allows me to kind of find people that I want to be around and create a space to be with them and to learn and share from them. Textbook learning, of course, is important, and I'm a big academic, but that connection human library piece is also really important. So how did I get from New York back home to Ottawa? So that is a slightly messy story. And the Coles Notes version of it is that we had always planned to move back to Canada when the kids got to a stage where they were, I don't know, 4 or 5, well, 3 or 4, we were thinking about school. I looked around at the experience they were going to have in New York and in Brooklyn. And don't get me wrong, it was an incredible, rich, diverse community we were living in. The challenge was that the local school where they were to go had 33 different languages being spoken at home. And I could see that for my children to get ahead and my children to have the opportunities that I had been given, which was really important to me from an education perspective, Steve and I were going to have to work harder. We were going to have to step on a treadmill of New York. We were going to have to hire the nannies. The whole thing was going to just expand like crazy. And I wasn't sure if I wanted that vision. And this is where I think personal narratives and how the stories you tell yourself get really interesting. I couldn't imagine my children in a life or a narrative that wasn't more familiar to the one I had grown up with. The second part of this was we had 4 grandparents in one city. And so that pull was really real. I often think about how if we'd had a grandparent on the West Coast and grandparents on the East Coast, the pull would have been the same if we wouldn't have kept our roots in a city like New York. And there's some parallel Jenny Mitchell running around in New York City. Um, So another milestone, we come back when my kids are just little, and I can remember, oh my gosh, you guys, the visual of having a 6-week-old baby. I actually remember the experience of getting the passport for that 6-week-old baby, going into this big, huge gymnasium, football-sized room, waiting in line to pick up the passport. And I remember nursing and all these different people and all these different cultures. And it was just this wonderful melting pot, but also holding this little baby with no vaccinations and thinking about, oh my gosh, is this the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? So that, just want to acknowledge all that self-doubt that was coming up about these big milestone changes. So we arrive home in Canada, we settle into life, we start to build a life here in Ottawa. And another milestone, and I talk about career transitions here, I wanted to work part-time. I had decided that this was the way I could take care of my family, a way I could keep my brain moving, and I really craved work. Like I really enjoyed the work I was doing. By then I sort of identified as a professional fundraiser. So I went to a conference in Ottawa, and my goal was, notice the specificity of the goal, to meet all the consultants in the room so that I could maybe piece off work for them and help them and work for them and learn in really a professional mentorship experience. Sidebar, at Chavender, we also have a professional mentorship experience where you can hire us to mentor your team through those beginning years of fund development, especially if there's not someone on your team that is really versed, or in a lot of cases, the CEO is versed but doesn't have the time to do it. So I embarked in a professional mentorship with a woman who is still in my life today. I'm very grateful for that friendship and all the things that she has imparted and shared with me over our lifetime together. We've actually done some presentations together, which was kind of like another milestone for me. So I was able to secure work as a consultant, doing basically all the grunt work for other consultants, things like grants, things like reports, things like outreach, things like, booking meetings, a lot of communications. I did a lot of annual reports in those days, and I learned how to do this stuff. And that was a great experience and a wonderful transition for me to a new identity. So remember at the beginning, I promised you this was about the narratives we tell ourselves. I hope you're hearing how over time I'm shifting those narratives. I'm shifting the stories I tell about myself so that they align with who I desire to be. It doesn't happen incidentally, you guys. It doesn't happen without thought and process and thinking and maybe a little bit of journaling. As I've gotten older, I've done more of that, and imagining who you'd like to become or who you are becoming. In the coaching world, we say who you be. I always like that idea that the present is the most important tense. And yet so many of us live our lives in the forward and in the back. So after many years, a couple of years of doing that, my colleague that I was working with, there wasn't enough work in her business. And so I had the opportunity or another milestone to go out on my own. I said, okay, well, I guess I'll put a shingle out and I'll have to figure out how to do a website. And I guess I'll have to figure out how to get business cards. And I named my company Chavender. And if you go back to the podcast, you'll hear the story, the origin of What's with the Fish and how that name came about. So I'll invite you to go back to another podcast to listen to that. And I learned how to find clients. So spoiler alert, just because you're good at something doesn't mean that people are knocking down your door. And that was a really big part of getting out from behind the business, getting in front of the business, and getting comfortable being a personality, being someone visible to others. And I know that a lot of the women I coach, we talk a lot about visibility. We talk a lot about being visible and the kind of risks that has for women, especially women of visible minorities or women of different who identify from different sexualities. So that is a process that I spent a couple of years on. And I realized that in order for the business to grow, in order for me to be able to provide for my family, and to be honest, to continue to grow my leadership skills, getting out in front of people was going to be part of my goal. And I was smart enough to watch how others did it. So that's another theme. Notice people that are doing it well and ask yourself, what are they doing? What are they doing well? What do I like about it? But it absolutely came up against a bunch of bumps for me about the role I was supposed to play. The narratives that I have been taught as a kid were, stay in your box, don't be too loud. I had told you on this podcast, this solo podcast, that I had a big personality. I had a lot of ideas. I was maybe too much to take sometimes. And I think about that a lot. I wish I could go back and kind of be a fly on the wall and see what that looked like. But society, it's not only our families, right? It's society tells us as women if you can conform, if you can stay in this little box and be within those parameters of acceptability, you will be okay. You will be safe. And I did that for a long time. I played safe with the business. I definitely made money. I definitely got experiences. But those times when I had to stretch myself felt even more scary because I had all these voices in my head telling me, "Oh my God, don't screw this up. This is going to be terrible. You could really mess this up. And then what are you going to do?" Right? um, and I try one of my styles, one of my core values, I guess, as a coach and as a leader and as a woman, I guess, is really pulling down the walls on this facade of everybody else has it figured out. We are imperfect humans walking around this planet doing the very best we can with the tools we have, with the resources we have today. I am a very different person than I was 10 years ago, but I'll tell you one thing. I do show up every day trying to be just a little bit better than I was yesterday. Sometimes I get it right, sometimes I don't, but that element of personal leadership, that commitment to myself, is something that's always served me well in the work that I've done. And I'm not giving that one up. I am not giving that one up. And it is a core tenet of who I am, whether you call me a learner, whether you call me a leader, that personal leadership piece and personal choice, sovereignty over the things that you do. I'm going to say that there were times in my life where I let things happen to me rather than being a participant in the things. And I am no longer, milestone here. I am no longer letting that happen in my life. I am taking responsibility for my actions, the good and the bad. And I am forging forward with who I am and how I want to be in the world. And the business is growing alongside that. The more I show up, the more intentional I am with how I behave, the kind of wake, that like the boats, the wake that I provide behind me, the more people resonate with it. And so I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going. And I think about tonight and this award that actually, it doesn't even matter if the award is presented to me or not. I'll be completely honest. For me, it's the achievement of being nominated and acknowledging and celebrating myself. Because I know another thing about women, it's very hard to celebrate ourselves. It's very hard to say, I did that. Do you know how many times in an executive coaching call with a client, they say to me, oh, it wasn't my experience. It was all the team. And I want to say, like, I am so happy you're celebrating your team, but you built the team too. It's okay to take your piece of this because it's not like you know, shining a light is a finite amount of thing. It's not like you shining the light on your team or you, let me put this way. You shining the light on your accomplishments and your pieces doesn't diminish. There's no less light for your team. Imagine if we could amplify this, we could flip it and imagine that the more I celebrate my leadership and the more I step into it and the more I own it, the more other people around me can own theirs and own who they are and own what their greatest gifts are. Because I can tell you, I have some wonderful gifts, but they're not all gorgeous. Just ask my family. Um, for example, one of the things that I really struggle with on the weekends is like I got 12 million projects and I start one and then I go to number 6 and then I go to number 2. I'm like all over the place. To which point my husband usually yells at this moment, "Stop, Jenny. Do we have to dart the rhinoceros?" And so getting and that's always like a trigger for me, right? So I slow down. I regroup. I think about what I want to do. And so I offer these to you in this podcast for you to think about the milestones in your life and what those stories are that you've told yourself about them. And similarly, if there are milestones in your life that you're not happy about, not proud about, how can you sit with those milestones and sit with those experiences to shift them so that they can serve you better going forward? And that really is the message of this podcast, I guess. It was prompted by a client who said, "Jenny, it'd be really cool to learn more about you and have more time." So here you go. This is sort of Jenny, where she came from, what she thought about during her stages. And maybe I'll close with um, where I'm at now, which is unapologetically moving forward into abundance, into possibility, into growing the business, into meeting more amazing, cool, interesting, driven, smart, observant women leaders who end up being my coaching clients, to building more communities of women where we support each other. It sounds so simple, where we support each other. Let me define it: where we celebrate each other, where we send nudges to say, "I got you, I see you, well done," where we hold space for hard conversations when we don't think they're in that space, where we don't think that they're showing up in their best selves, when there might be wallowing happening and what they need is kindness, not niceness. To be kind is to tell someone what you really think. To be nice is to kind of flip over it and gloss over it. And the last thing I would say that I'm working on is um, building space for the different things I want in my business and in my life. So I can definitely see that work, I wonder who will relate to this. Work has been an escape for me for so many things and for so long. Work is the thing I'm good at. Work is the thing I know. Work is the thing that will magically have this sort of positive dopamine rewards. Relationships, connections, family, those are, and I would even say motherhood, are those things where I'm still a work in progress and they're not so clear. They're not so straight lined. There are places where I might feel really inadequate sometimes. And so doing those things and being there in those things, like sitting still, is one of the hardest things for me to do, but I am working on it. Those are places where I feel less confident. And so what do? I just roll myself back into work because that's what I know. So this next iteration of me, this I don't know, 5.0, I guess we'll call it, is about working dang hard because I love my work and I love to dive in, but also playing really hard and booking those trips and enjoying those things and having those experiences. And you can hear the emotion in my voice when I talk about that. That's really interesting. That we can have it all. We can, if we set the boundaries that we want, and if we take the time to be intentional about where we're going and what's most important to us. And I'll tell you, it feels amazing on this side of the equation. And I am hell bent on staying on this side of the equation and helping others get to this side of the equation. Whatever it is you're tolerating, whatever it is that you're not happy about, whatever it is that's niggling at you, there is another choice. and you are capable of making that choice. Now, you might want to work with a coach or work with a friend or work with someone to get there, but don't settle. Life's too short for that. And so, with that, dear listeners, I close. I'd like to thank that client for prompting me to record this, to have a solo podcast all about me. Coaching questions for you. I love to leave you with them. What are you tolerating in your life? What stories are you telling yourself about those narratives? And how would you like to go back and change them or shift them or let them serve you? And where would you like to lead in your life? It's been a real pleasure spending this time with you. Sidebar, I am going this afternoon to get my hair done and my makeup done, which is so not a Jenny Mitchell thing from before. And so is a Jenny Mitchell thing in the 5.0 version. And I'm going to really enjoy tonight. I'm going to celebrate. I think you guys are my accountability for an amazing evening in partnership and in collaboration with all these wonderful businesswomen in Ottawa. And thank you for listening.